Hey, thanks for being here. Get comfortable and let's drift into the world of Norse mythology. The Viking world did not end in chaos. It did not collapse overnight beneath foreign swords or vanish in a single dramatic year. Instead, it reached a peak, broad, interconnected, and quietly strained, before slowly, almost imperceptibly, changing into something else. To understand the end of the Viking Age, we have to begin not with its final moments, but with the world as it existed when Viking society was at its height. A world that was still powerful, still feared, still wealthy, yet already transforming beneath the surface. By the late 10th century, the Viking Age was no longer young. It had matured. What began centuries earlier as scattered coastal raids had evolved into a vast web of trade routes, political alliances, settlements, and kingdoms. Scandinavia was no longer a distant fringe of Europe. It was deeply entangled with it. Across Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, power was consolidating. The old patchwork of independent chieftains was thinning, replaced by ambitious kings who ruled larger territories and demanded loyalty not just through reputation, but through law and force. This shift did not happen cleanly or peacefully. It was messy, uneven, and often violent. But it was unmistakable. The Viking world at its height was no longer defined solely by raiding. Raiding still existed, and it could still be brutal and effective, but it was no longer the primary engine of wealth. Trade had taken its place. From the Baltic Sea to the rivers of Eastern Europe, Scandinavian merchants traveled routes that stretched farther than most people of the age could imagine. Furs from the north, amber from the coasts, walrus ivory from Arctic waters, iron, weapons, and enslaved people moved outward. In return came silver, silk, spices, glassware, and ideas. Viking ships carried more than warriors. They carried merchants fluent in multiple languages, negotiators who understood foreign customs, and settlers looking for stability rather than glory. Markets mattered now. Reputation mattered. Predictability mattered. Towns such as Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang were not raiding bases. They were hubs, crowded, noisy places where traders from different cultures met, argued, bargained, and shared news. Coins circulated more widely. Weights and measures became standardized. Written contracts, once rare, began to appear. This economic shift quietly reshaped values. In earlier generations, wealth was something seized. A successful raid brought silver, prestige, and stories that could be told for years. By the late Viking Age, wealth was increasingly accumulated slowly, through tolls, taxes, land ownership, and trade agreements. The skills that mattered most were changing. A man who could organize trade routes or collect taxes reliably became more valuable than one who could swing an axe well. This was not a rejection of violence. Violence remained deeply embedded in Viking culture, but it was no longer the only path to power, and that mattered. Social structure reflected this transition. The old ideal of the independent warrior farmer still existed, but it was under pressure. Kings demanded service. Laws demanded obedience. Land ownership became more formalized, with clearer boundaries and obligations. Thing assemblies still met, but their authority increasingly competed with royal decrees. Justice was no longer only personal or communal, it was becoming institutional. Even religion, though still outwardly pagan in many regions, was beginning to feel that pressure. Traditional Norse belief systems were woven into daily life. Seasonal rituals, oaths sworn on sacred objects, reverence for ancestors and gods tied to land and kin. But these beliefs were local, flexible, and decentralized. They had no unified hierarchy. That flexibility had once been a strength. Now it became a vulnerability. Christianity, spreading steadily from the south, offered something different. Not just a god, but an institution, a structure. A network that connected rulers across borders. Kings who adopted Christianity did not just gain a new faith, they gained legitimacy in the eyes of powerful neighbors. At the height of the Viking world, this tension was unresolved. Pagan rituals still marked life events, Burial customs still reflected older beliefs. But Christian symbols were appearing, first among elites, then more widely. This coexistence was uneasy, not yet a breaking point, but no longer balanced. The Viking world was also more settled than ever before. By this stage, Scandinavians were no longer newcomers abroad. Large Viking-descended populations lived permanently in places that had once been targets of raids. Parts of England, Ireland, Normandy, and the eastern river systems were shaped as much by Scandinavian customs as by local traditions. These communities needed stability. Farms, churches, markets, and families could not exist in a state of constant warfare. Peace was not just preferable, it was necessary. And peace demanded rules. Back in Scandinavia, this reality echoed. Raiding abroad risked retaliation. Trade demanded trust. Diplomacy demanded restraint. Kings began to see uncontrolled raiding not as a tradition to be celebrated, but as a liability. A warband acting independently could undermine treaties. A raid gone wrong could provoke a costly war. What had once been a tool of expansion now threatened hard-earned stability. At the same time, Europe itself was changing. The continent that Vikings had once found divided, poorly defended, and politically fragmented was becoming harder to exploit. Local rulers had learned. Coastal defenses improved. Rivers were guarded. Fortifications multiplied. The easy targets were gone. This did not make Viking warriors weak. It made Viking opportunities scarce. At its height, the Viking world was therefore paradoxical. It was strong, wealthy, connected, and influential, yet constrained by the very success it had achieved. Power now flowed through kingship rather than individual fame. Wealth moved through trade rather than plunder. Faith was shifting from local gods to universal doctrine. Law was becoming written, enforceable, and centralized. None of this felt like an ending at the time. For the people living within it, this was simply the present, a world adapting to new realities. A world still recognizably Viking, but no longer defined solely by what it had once been. The seeds of the end were already planted, not in defeat, but in success. And as the Viking Age reached its height, it did so standing at the edge of transformation, not collapse. That transformation would not come from a single battle or ruler. It would arrive slowly, through belief, law, and necessity. And it would change Scandinavia forever. The transformation of the Viking world did not begin with swords or laws. It began with belief. More than any single battle, more than any foreign invasion, the slow Christianization of Scandinavia reshaped the foundations of Viking society from within. It did not arrive as a sudden conversion, nor did it erase the old ways overnight. Instead, it spread unevenly, quietly, and often pragmatically, changing how power worked, how communities were organized, and how people understood their place in the world. For centuries, Norse belief systems had been deeply local. Gods were tied to land, kinship, and seasonal rhythms. Rituals took place in groves, halls, and farms. Authority came from tradition and memory rather than scripture. There was no single religious hierarchy, no central institution, and no universal doctrine that bound all Scandinavians together. That flexibility had allowed Norse belief to adapt easily. New gods could be adopted, old ones could fade. Practices varied from region to region without conflict. Faith was woven into life rather than imposed upon it. Christianity was different. Christian belief arrived not just as a set of spiritual ideas, but as a system, structured, organized, and deeply connected to political authority beyond Scandinavia. To accept Christianity was not simply to change gods. It was to enter a wider world of alliances, expectations, and obligations. The earliest Christian influences entered Scandinavia through contact, not conquest. Traders, captives, missionaries, and foreign brides carried the faith northward, long before kings openly embraced it. Crosses appeared as jewelry long before churches were built. Christian burial practices appeared alongside pagan ones. For generations, the two systems existed side by side. This coexistence was not peaceful because it was tolerant. It was peaceful because it was practical. Many early converts did not abandon the old gods. They added a new one, a god who promised protection, legitimacy, and favor in dealings with Christian rulers to the south. For a trader, a chieftain, or a war leader negotiating abroad, Christianity could be useful. The real turning point came when kings recognized that Christianity offered something pagan belief could not: centralized authority. A Christian king ruled by divine approval. His authority could be framed as sacred rather than negotiated. His laws could be enforced not just by threat of violence, but by moral obligation. His rule could be legitimized in the eyes of powerful neighbors who already operated within Christian frameworks. Conversion was rarely about personal faith alone. It was about stability, succession, and recognition. As Scandinavian rulers began to consolidate power, Christianity became a tool. Churches supported kings. Kings protected churches. Clergy educated administrators. Written records replaced oral memory. Law codes began to reflect Christian ethics and structures. This process was uneven. Some regions converted earlier. Some resisted fiercely. There were uprisings, forced baptisms, and reversals. Pagan sanctuaries were destroyed. New churches were built atop old sacred sites. But once a ruling elite committed to Christianity, the direction became difficult to reverse. Christianity undermined older power structures almost immediately. Pagan priests held influence through tradition and ritual. They could not compete with a literate clergy trained within a trans-regional institution, nor could local gods compete with a universal one tied to kingship. The Christian Church also redefined morality in ways that weakened Viking raiding culture. Raiding had once been socially acceptable, even honorable. It brought wealth, status, and reputation. Under Christian ethics, raiding fellow Christians became morally suspect. Violence did not disappear, but it required justification. Kings who wished to maintain peace in trade now had religious backing to suppress independent warbands. Raiding was reframed as disorder. Order became virtue. Burial practices changed. Cremation faded. Grave goods disappeared. The dead were no longer equipped for an afterlife of feasting and battle. Instead, salvation became internal, spiritual, and individual. This altered how people thought about death and therefore how they lived. The Church also introduced new rhythms. Feast days, fasts, and liturgical calendars replaced older seasonal rituals. Time itself became structured differently. Life was no longer guided solely by agricultural cycles and ancestral custom, but by a shared, standardized religious schedule. For ordinary people, conversion was slow. Many continued old practices privately for generations. Folk traditions lingered, old stories survived, but public life changed. Markets moved near churches. Law assemblies adopted Christian oaths. Marriage, inheritance, and legitimacy became regulated by ecclesiastical rules. What mattered most was not belief, but alignment. Once Christianity became the language of power, those who resisted found themselves marginalized. Chieftains who clung to the old ways struggled to compete with kings backed by clergy, literacy, and foreign recognition. The old gods were not defeated in battle. They were outgrown. Christianity did not end the Viking Age by force. It ended it by redefining what was acceptable, lawful, and honorable. It reshaped identity from the inside out. By the time conversion spread widely across Scandinavia, the Viking world was still strong, but it was no longer culturally suited for raiding as a way of life. The axe did not fall, the altar rose. And with it came a new order that quietly closed the door on the old one. The end of the Viking Age did not come from foreign conquest. It came from kings. As belief reshaped values, power reshaped behavior. Across Scandinavia, the gradual rise of centralized kingship changed the rules of survival so thoroughly that the old raiding economy could no longer function. What had once been a world of independent war leaders and negotiated authority hardened into one of borders, taxes, and enforced law. In the earlier Viking Age, power was personal. A chieftain ruled because others chose to follow him. Loyalty was earned through generosity, success, and reputation. If a leader failed, followers left. Authority could be challenged openly, sometimes violently, without destroying the system itself. That model depended on mobility and opportunity. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, those conditions were disappearing. Land was claimed. Trade routes were formalized. Settlements became permanent. Kings emerged, who did not rely on reputation alone but on territory. Territory changed everything. A king who ruled land could extract wealth without raiding. He could demand taxes, labor, and military service. He could enforce laws that applied whether people agreed with them or not. He no longer needed warbands operating independently. In fact, they became dangerous. Independent raiders disrupted trade. They threatened diplomatic agreements. They invited retaliation from stronger, more organized states. What had once built power now undermined it. Centralized kingship required predictability. To maintain authority, kings needed stable revenue. Raiding produced windfalls, not reliability. A successful raid one year could not guarantee income the next. Taxes, tolls, and controlled trade could. This economic shift turned violence inward. Kings began suppressing the very behaviors their ancestors had celebrated. Unauthorized raiding was reframed as criminal. Feuds were restricted. Private warfare became illegal. Law codes defined penalties for violence that had once been resolved through blood payment or revenge. The warrior did not disappear, but he was absorbed. Military service became institutional. Kings raised armies through obligation rather than charisma. Fighters served the crown, not themselves. Campaigns were planned, limited, and political. The axe was still used. It was simply no longer free. Written law accelerated this transformation. As literacy spread through church and court, law ceased to be memory-based. Disputes were recorded. Precedents mattered. Authority could now outlive individuals. This weakened the old system of negotiation and replacement. A chieftain could once be abandoned. A king could not. Resistance did not vanish quietly. In many regions, consolidation was violent. Rivals were eliminated. Forced oaths bound communities to rulers they had not chosen. Some kings ruled briefly, toppled by challengers, only for the process to resume under another name. But the direction was irreversible. Once a king controlled territory, resources, and religious legitimacy, the independent raider had no place to stand. Even socially, the shift was profound. In the old system, status was earned through visible action. Success abroad, gifts distributed at feasts, stories told by witnesses. In the new system, status flowed downward from the crown. Titles, offices, and land grants replaced reputation. Prestige became bureaucratic. The very skills that defined Viking success lost value. Seamanship, combat experience, and daring mattered less than loyalty, administration, and obedience. A man who could manage land was more useful than one who could raid it. The law reinforced this reality. Penalties for theft, violence, and rebellion grew harsher. Kings framed obedience as both legal and moral duty, reinforced by Christian doctrine. Raiding, once a respected livelihood, became a violation of order. For those raised in the old traditions, this was not progress. It was suffocation. Some adapted, others resisted. Many were absorbed into the new hierarchy, serving kings they would once have challenged. But no new generation grew up expecting raiding to be their future. The death of the raider economy did not require defeat, it required irrelevance. By the time centralized kingship had taken hold across Scandinavia, the Viking Age had already lost its engine. The systems that sustained it, personal authority, mobile violence, negotiated power had been replaced. What remained was a medieval state. The transition was not mourned, it was barely noticed. Life continued. People farmed, traded, married, and worshipped. But the world that had made Viking raiders possible no longer existed. The Viking Age did not end in flames. It ended in law. Even as kings tightened their grip at home, the world beyond Scandinavia was changing just as decisively. The Viking Age had flourished not only because Scandinavians were skilled sailors and warriors, but because Europe itself had once been vulnerable. Fragmented authority, poorly defended coastlines, and limited coordination between regions had created openings that raiders could exploit again and again. By the late 10th and 11th centuries, those openings were closing. This was not a single reform or invention, but a broad transformation across the European continent. Rulers learned, communities adapted. And the conditions that had once made Viking expansion possible quietly disappeared. The most visible change was fortification. Where earlier generations had relied on wooden palisades or none at all, stone now reshaped the landscape. Castles rose along rivers, coastlines, and strategic crossings. Towns encircled themselves with walls. Monasteries fortified their grounds. Watchtowers appeared where none had stood before. These were not just defenses. They were statements. A fortified town declared permanence. It announced that wealth would be protected, that authority was rooted, and that attackers would face organized resistance rather than panic. For Viking raiders accustomed to speed and surprise, this mattered deeply. A successful raid depended on arriving unopposed, striking quickly, and vanishing before a response could form. Walls disrupted that rhythm. Garrisons delayed it. Signals and messengers shattered it. Raiding became riskier, slower, and far less profitable. Rivers, once highways into the heart of Europe, were no longer open invitations. Chains blocked channels. Forts guarded bends and bridges. Patrols monitored traffic. Toll stations demanded payment. What had once been effortless movement turned into negotiation. At the same time, European military organization matured. Local levies were supplemented by trained retainers. Lords coordinated their responses. Kings could mobilize forces more quickly and over greater distances. Vikings did not face helpless villages anymore. They faced resistance. Even when raids succeeded, retaliation followed. Coastal defenses allowed regions to recover faster. Losses were absorbed. Communities rebuilt. The psychological impact of raiding diminished. Earlier Viking attacks had carried terror precisely because they were unpredictable and devastating. By the 11th century, they were expected, and expectation breeds preparation. Political consolidation played an equally important role. As kingdoms strengthened across Europe, local disputes that Vikings had once exploited were reduced. Alliances formed, borders hardened, rulers communicated. A raid against one territory could provoke a response from several. This made diplomacy more important than violence. Scandinavian leaders who wished to trade or settle abroad now needed permission rather than intimidation. Treaties replaced threats. Marriage alliances replaced hostage-taking. The transformation of former Viking settlements reinforced this shift. Regions once shaped by Scandinavian conquest, parts of Britain, Ireland, and the continent, were now fully integrated into European political systems. Their populations no longer identified as targets or outsiders. They were subjects of kings. Raiding them meant attacking familiar territory, kin, or trade partners. The frontier had vanished. Expansion also slowed because there was nowhere left to expand into. The best lands were already claimed. Remaining opportunities were marginal, distant, or fiercely defended. Even overseas ventures became less attractive. Maintaining control required administration, garrisons, and long-term investment, the very structures Vikings had once avoided. Trade, by contrast, offered lower risk and steady return. Merchants could profit without provoking war. Kings could collect tolls without bloodshed. Communities could grow without fear. This economic logic spread quickly. European markets welcomed Scandinavian goods, but not Scandinavian violence. Participation required conformity to local norms. Raiding violated them. Gradually, the external world stopped rewarding Viking behavior. This did not mean Scandinavians lost their skill at sea or war. It meant those skills no longer granted advantage. A sword was less useful against stone walls. A fast ship meant little if every harbor was guarded. The world that had once invited Viking expansion had closed itself. Not with a gate slammed shut, but with many doors quietly locked. As Europe stabilized, the Viking Age lost its external fuel. The opportunities that had drawn generations abroad dried up. Combined with internal consolidation at home, the result was inevitable. Vikings did not stop sailing. They stopped being needed. And with that, the age defined by expansion gave way to one defined by borders, treaties, and permanence. If the Viking Age did not end in collapse, it also did not end in disappearance. In some places, Vikings did not fade away at all. They transformed. Nowhere is this clearer than in the story of the Normans. What began as a Viking foothold became one of the most powerful political forces in medieval Europe. And in that transformation lies one of the clearest explanations for how the Viking Age ended. Not with extinction, but with absorption. The region that would become Normandy was once a frontier zone, vulnerable, contested, and difficult for distant rulers to control. Viking raiders exploited this weakness repeatedly, sailing up rivers, extracting tribute, and retreating before a response could form. Eventually, violence gave way to negotiation. Rather than endlessly fighting Scandinavian warbands, local rulers chose accommodation. Land was granted in exchange for protection. Raiders became defenders. Outsiders became stakeholders. This was not a surrender, it was a recalculation. The Vikings who settled in Normandy did not arrive intending to abandon their identity. They arrived seeking stability, wealth, and legitimacy. The same motivations that had always driven Viking expansion. What they found was a world where success required adaptation. Within a generation, Scandinavian settlers adopted the local language. Norse speech faded. Names changed. Law codes shifted. Intermarriage blurred distinctions. Christianity, already a political necessity, became a cultural anchor. Churches multiplied. Clergy recorded events. Pagan practices disappeared from public life. Most importantly, the Normans embraced feudal structures. Land was held not by personal strength alone, but by legal grant. Loyalty flowed upward through clearly defined hierarchies. Military service became obligation rather than opportunity. The independent Viking war leader had no place in this system. Yet, Viking influence did not vanish. It was redirected. Norman rulers retained the Viking emphasis on discipline, organization, and martial skill. Their armies were cohesive, their leadership decisive, their ambitions expansive. But their methods were no longer Viking. Conquest was framed as rightful rule. Violence was justified through claims, inheritance, and divine approval. Expansion was bureaucratic as much as it was military. The Norman conquest of England stands as a symbolic echo of the Viking past, aggressive, transformative, and decisive, yet fundamentally different in character. The Normans did not raid England. They conquered it. They arrived not as opportunists, but as claimants. Their victory did not lead to withdrawal, but to administration. Castles followed, records followed, law followed. Within decades, England was reshaped, but not into a Viking society. It became a feudal one. This distinction matters. The Normans demonstrated that Viking energy could survive only by abandoning Viking identity. Elsewhere, similar patterns unfolded. Scandinavian elites across Europe adopted local customs, languages, and religious practices. What remained Scandinavian was increasingly genetic rather than cultural. This was not assimilation through force, it was assimilation through success. To thrive in a changing Europe, Vikings had to become Europeans. The qualities that had once defined them, adaptability, ambition, pragmatism, ensured that they would not vanish, but they would not remain what they had been. The Viking Age ended, not because its people failed, but because they succeeded too well. They learned the rules of the new world. And by following them, they made the old world obsolete. Power and belief reshaped the Viking world, but neither acted alone. Beneath kingship, beneath religion, and beneath politics lay forces that no ruler could command: climate, land, and the limits of survival. The Viking Age had always been shaped by environment. Scandinavia was never an easy place to live. Short growing seasons, thin soils, and long winters imposed strict limits on population and production. For generations, outward movement had been one solution to that pressure. By the late Viking Age, that solution was narrowing. Climate conditions fluctuated across the medieval period, and even modest shifts had consequences in the north. Cooler temperatures shortened growing seasons. Unpredictable weather increased the risk of crop failure. Marginal lands became harder to sustain. Agriculture in Scandinavia operated close to its limits. Farms relied on narrow windows of productivity. A poor harvest could not be offset easily. Storage mattered, planning mattered, stability mattered. Raiding did not help fields recover. As population slowly increased, pressure on land intensified. Forests were cleared. Pastures expanded. Settlements pushed into less fertile areas. The result was vulnerability. Communities needed predictability more than adventure. Risk became dangerous rather than exciting. The household economy, not the war band, became the core unit of survival. Trade helped, but trade depended on peace. Markets could buffer shortages. Imported grain could save lives. But merchants required safe routes, reliable partners, and enforced agreements. Violence threatened all three. This placed further strain on raiding culture. The economics of Viking expansion had once made sense. A successful expedition could bring back wealth far beyond what the land could produce. But as targets hardened and returns diminished, risk outweighed reward. A failed raid meant death or ruin. Even success carried costs. Retaliation could follow. Trade relationships could collapse. Kings could punish offenders. The balance shifted. Settlement patterns reflect this change. Marginal colonies struggled. Some were abandoned. Others were absorbed into neighboring societies. Only those with strong trade links and political integration survived. The romantic image of endless Viking expansion hides a harsher truth. Sustainability mattered. The environment imposed limits that ideology could not overcome. Livestock required fodder, fields required labor, families required food. A society organized around seasonal violence could not meet those needs indefinitely. Gradually, priorities realigned. Investment flowed into farms, towns, and infrastructure rather than ships and weapons. Wealth was stored in land and buildings rather than silver hoards. The shift was practical, not ideological. People did not stop raiding because they became softer. They stopped because it no longer worked. Environmental pressure did not end the Viking Age on its own, but it narrowed choices. Combined with political consolidation and religious transformation, it made the old system untenable. The Viking Age was never an expression of endless aggression. It was an adaptation to scarcity. When conditions changed, adaptation changed with them. Survival demanded permanence, and permanence demanded restraint. The sea remained. The ships remained. But the reasons to leave home faded. What replaced them was a quieter struggle, to endure, to manage, and to belong within a world that no longer rewarded constant motion. Even as the forces that sustained the Viking Age faded, they did not vanish without resistance. The final centuries of Viking activity were marked by attempts to preserve an older way of power, not through scattered raids, but through the ambitions of kings who still carried the memory of expansion. These were not the Vikings of earlier generations. They were rulers, not raiders. Their campaigns were larger, more organized, and bound to the logic of medieval kingship. And yet, in their failures, the Viking Age reached its last recognizable expression. The late Viking world still produced formidable leaders. They commanded fleets, raised armies, and dreamed of overseas dominance. But they operated in a world that no longer rewarded speed and surprise alone. The last great expeditions were acts of assertion rather than opportunity. Kings sought legitimacy through conquest, not plunder. Their campaigns aimed to rule territory, not strip it. This distinction mattered. Such efforts required supply lines, administration, and sustained control, challenges that earlier Viking ventures had avoided by design. When Scandinavian rulers looked outward in the 11th century, they did so against hardened states. England, once fractured, now resisted with coordination. The continent responded with force rather than fear. Failure carried consequences. Lost armies could not be easily replaced. Fleets took years to rebuild. Political authority at home weakened when campaigns abroad failed. Each defeat narrowed options. At the same time, the image of the Viking warrior was changing. Courage remained admired, but recklessness was condemned. Kings needed obedience, not glory seekers. Those who clung to the old ideals found themselves sidelined. The last Viking kings ruled in tension, pulled between tradition and necessity. They relied on Christian legitimacy, enforced law, and sought recognition from foreign courts, even as they invoked ancestral memory. Their reigns marked a transitional generation. After them, the language of power shifted fully. Wars were justified through claims and treaties rather than custom. Armies became instruments of state rather than expressions of personal ambition. What lingered was symbolism. Sagas would later preserve the memory of heroic figures, of bold voyages and decisive battles. But these stories looked backward, not forward. The Viking Age did not end with a single defeat or death. It ended as its final champions failed to recreate a world that no longer existed. Their ships still sailed. Their swords still cut. But the age that had once given those tools meaning had passed. The last Viking kings did not fall in disgrace. They ruled, governed, and were remembered, but not as Vikings. They were medieval monarchs standing at the edge of a fading identity. When their generation ended, so too did the living memory of a Viking world. What remained was history. When the Viking Age ended, daily life did not shatter. There was no moment when farms were abandoned, ships burned, or people awoke to find themselves living in a new era. Instead, life continued, quieter, more regulated, and increasingly familiar to the medieval world beyond Scandinavia. This was the true transition, not from movement to stillness, but from one way of belonging to another. As raiding faded, the rhythms of life narrowed inward. Families became more rooted to land. Generations lived and died in the same places. Memory shortened. The sea, once a promise of wealth and identity, became simply part of the landscape. Christianity now shaped public life almost entirely. Churches stood at the center of communities, both physically and socially. Bells marked time. Feast days and fasts structured the year. Birth, marriage, and death passed through ecclesiastical authority. Belief no longer varied openly from household to household. This uniformity brought predictability. It also brought oversight. The Old Norse gods lingered only in story, habit, and language. Their names survived in place names and days of the week. Their myths were retold not as living truth, but as inherited memory. Law followed a similar path. Where once disputes were resolved through negotiation, compensation, or violence, they now passed through courts. Written law replaced memory. Punishment became standardized. Authority became impersonal. This altered social relationships profoundly. Honor was no longer defended primarily by force. Reputation mattered, but it was mediated through institutions. Feuds were discouraged. Order was valued. Literacy expanded slowly. Clergy recorded births, deaths, land transfers, and rulings. The past became fixed on parchment rather than reshaped through retelling. This changed how people understood themselves. Identity became local and stable rather than expansive. One belonged to a parish, a lord, a kingdom. The concept of being a Viking, a person defined by action and movement, lost relevance. Economic life reflected this shift. Wealth was measured in land, harvests, and obligations, rather than silver seized abroad. Markets connected regions. Trade replaced tribute. Ships were still built. Seafaring did not disappear. But voyages were planned, commercial, and regulated. The household replaced the warband as the core social unit. Children grew up expecting to inherit land, not seek fortune overseas. Skills were passed down through family rather than learned on campaign. Even storytelling changed. The sagas that would later define Viking memory were composed in this quieter world. They look backward with nostalgia, elevating ancestors whose lives no longer seemed possible. These stories preserved values that society itself no longer practiced. Courage, independence, and honor remained admired, but within boundaries. What emerged was medieval Scandinavia, a society Christian, agricultural, hierarchical, and integrated into Europe. The Viking Age did not end because Scandinavians lost their strength. It ended because their strength was redirected. The sea remained, but home mattered more. And in that shift, a new identity settled into place, one built not on departure, but on permanence. When the Viking Age passed into memory, it did not do so quietly. It was remembered, reshaped, and reinterpreted by generations who no longer lived within it. What survived was not the world itself, but stories. And stories do not preserve the past unchanged. The earliest accounts of Viking life were recorded after the Viking Age had already ended. They were written in a Christian, literate society looking backward at a pagan oral one. This distance mattered. Memory became selective. Violence was softened or framed as heroism. Pagan belief was recast as myth rather than lived religion. Kings and warriors were elevated, while ordinary lives faded from view. The sagas did not lie, but they did choose. They preserved values that no longer governed society. Courage, independence, loyalty, and honor remained central themes precisely because they were becoming harder to practice in a regulated world. In this way, Viking memory became aspirational. Christian writers faced a tension. Their ancestors had lived outside the faith that now defined moral truth. To reconcile this, pagan figures were often portrayed as noble, but misguided, admirable, yet incomplete. The old gods became characters rather than presences. This reframing allowed societies to claim continuity without contradiction. One could honor the past without returning to it. Over time, the Viking Age hardened into legend. Centuries later, medieval chroniclers and early modern scholars revisited these stories with new agendas. National identity, royal legitimacy, and cultural pride shaped interpretation. The Viking became a symbol. Sometimes this symbol represented freedom and strength. Sometimes it represented chaos and barbarism. The same past could be praised or condemned depending on the needs of the present. In the modern era, Romantic nationalism elevated the Viking even further. The complexity of medieval Scandinavia was flattened into imagery: ships, helmets, warriors, divorced from historical context. The Viking Age was no longer a process, it became a moment. This transformation obscured the truth of its ending. There was no single date when the Viking Age ended. No final battle marked its conclusion. Instead, it dissolved into new forms of life. But memory prefers clarity. So the Viking Age was given boundaries it never had. It was framed as an era of heroes followed by decline. This narrative comforted later generations. It suggested that something pure had been lost rather than something complex transformed. Yet the real legacy of the Viking Age lies not in what ended, but in what endured. Scandinavian law, trade networks, settlement patterns, and political structures carried forward into the medieval world. The people did not vanish. Their descendants shaped Europe. Even today, the Viking Age is invoked as identity rather than history. This enduring fascination says less about the past than about the present. We return to the Vikings because they represent movement in a world that feels constrained, independence in a world governed by rules, and identity forged through action rather than inheritance. The Viking Age did not survive as reality. It survived as meaning. And meaning, once separated from context, becomes myth. The final transformation of the Viking Age was not into silence, but into story. The Viking Age did not end on a battlefield, nor did it vanish beneath the weight of a single decision or ruler. It ended the way most eras do, gradually, unevenly, and almost unnoticed by those living through it. By the time people spoke of Vikings as figures of the past, the world that had produced them had already changed beyond recognition. What once defined the Viking Age was not violence alone, but motion, movement across seas, opportunity beyond the horizon. A belief that identity could be forged through action rather than inheritance. That belief no longer fit the world that emerged. Borders hardened, authority centralized, faith standardized, law written. The sea remained, but it no longer promised transformation. The skills that once made Vikings feared, speed, independence, adaptability, did not disappear. They were absorbed into new systems that valued order over improvisation. Scandinavia did not decline, it integrated. Its people became farmers, traders, priests, administrators, and kings within a medieval European framework. Their societies stabilized, their institutions endured. The cost of that stability was the loss of a way of life defined by departure. What ended was not a people, but a phase of human adaptation. The Viking Age had been a response to scarcity, fragmentation, and opportunity. When those conditions changed, so did behavior. This does not diminish the past. It clarifies it. The Vikings were not anomalies, they were human. Their age rose because it worked, it ended because it no longer did. And yet, its memory persists. We remember the Vikings not because they lasted, but because they moved, because they crossed boundaries, geographic, cultural, and psychological. In a world increasingly defined by rules and permanence, that memory resonates. But history is not meant to comfort, it is meant to explain. The end of the Viking Age was not tragedy, it was transition. A transformation from motion to settlement, from reputation to institution, from belief shaped by land to belief shaped by doctrine, from sea to soil. The ships were not burned. They were simply no longer needed. And so the Viking Age ended, not with fire or silence, but with continuity. If you enjoyed this journey through the close of the Viking world, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep these long, quiet histories alive. And now, settle back, knowing that the Vikings did not disappear. They became the world that followed.